and welcome to this edition of Alabama Adventures. Today we're not going to be talking about Bigfoot. It won't be getting close to Bigfoot. It's going to be getting close to a UFO. A while back I was in Alexander City, or Alexander City is called Alex City by most of the people in this area. Anyway, that's just part of Southern English, cutting out unnecessary syllables and words that you get the same meaning out of by just saying a couple of syllables rather than saying 15. But anyway, what I want to tell you about is a couple of UFO encounters that I've been told happened over the years down there. This morning I had to go to Alex City, and I left about 9, and I got back around noon that day. And I'm telling you that so I can tell you something else. Many years ago, my grandfather, I used to carry him to Alex City every once in a while, like to the doctor or to buy groceries or whatever he needed to do down there. And every time we passed this one certain place down near New Site, Alabama, he would always tell me that between Motley, Alabama, and Alex City, that this particular little store here was the halfway point. And if I have time in this video, I'm going to go into more detail on that. It's sort of an interesting little story, and if we have time at the end of it, I'll tell you about what happened at the halfway point going to Alex City. But anyway, what I want to tell you about today to begin with is, like I said, 2 UFO sightings that have occurred on Lake Martin. And I know you have heard about Lake Martin in some previous videos I've done. It's a very beautiful lake down there. It's a very large lake. It's a very old lake. There are some mansions built around that lake. If you're ever down there, if you ever go across Kalijah Bridge, that's where you'll see some tremendously beautiful homes over there on the far side of the lake. Kalijah Bridge is a whole lot different than what it used to be. I can remember crossing Kalijah Bridge back when it was a 1-lane metal bridge down there, and it was a long bridge, and you didn't think you'd ever get to the side of it, and only one car at a time could actually cross this bridge. But that's just the way it was. But that's one thing that the people in Alabama do have to thank George Wallace for. Regardless of what George Wallace is remembered for, one thing that George Wallace did that really helped this state when he was in office, and he served several terms, his wife served a term. I couldn't tell you exactly how many terms he did serve as governor here, but anyway, I'll brag on him for just a little bit. He did increase car tags when he went in office, and all of that money undoubtedly went to building highways and bridges and roads and that type of stuff that we really needed here in the state. There was some rough, terrible roads back then, but thanks to George Wallace, a lot of interstates came to Alabama. A lot of the state highways were widened and improved, and all of those old metal 1-lane wooden bridges, except for a few dirt roads that are still left around. You'll find one every once in a while. But the ones that were on the main roads, like between Montgomery and Mobile and Birmingham and places like that, all were replaced by modern day bridges that are still holding up today. They get inspected every once in a while, and they were some tremendously well built bridges, and I will brag on the people that built those bridges back then. They did an excellent job. Anyway, getting on the boat of what we're talking about, I like to get sidetracked, as you know, in these videos, but anyway, getting back to Kalijah down there, Kalijah became very famous whenever Hank Williams lived in one of the cabins down there for some time, whenever he wrote the song Kalijah. But anyway, getting on back to what we're talking about, the UFOs. I want to tell you these 2 particular UFOs encounters and sightings that happened on Lake Martin. Okay, so now let's go on to this first UFO story that I received a few years ago from a man and his wife who lived in Alex City. And I met these people one day in a business, and something came up about paranormal. And of course, when I'm around, something usually comes up about the paranormal phenomenon. And they said, want to know if I was interested in UFO sightings like on Lake Martin. And I told them I certainly was, that any type of paranormal activity down that way or anywhere I was always interested in. But anyway, this is the story that they told me. They said, well, let me tell you where it happened first. If you're on 280 and you're going east toward Auburn, as you begin leaving Alexander City, or Alex City, whatever you want to call it, you'll come to an intersection that's Coven Abbott Road. And if you turn right on Coven Abbott Road, like you're going down to Wind Creek Park, you will come up on this boat ramp where this encounter happened. Now, this is a picture number 5 here, is a picture of the sign that says Coven Abbott Road, and it says boat ramp. And this boat ramp is a very major part of this particular UFO encounter. Okay, now picture number 6 here is a picture of the actual boat ramp, and down at the bottom you can see the little handrail that you can hold to whenever you're getting in or out of your boat after you've got it launched in the water down there. Okay, now that's where the people undoubtedly that's going to be in this UFO encounter had left their vehicle and their boat trailer that night here at this particular boat ramp. And if people in that area look at it, then you'll most likely recognize this particular boat ramp. What happened, man and his wife and his 2 teenage daughters had been somewhere on this particular night, and they turned on Coven Abbott Road as a shortcut to go back to their house. And as they neared the bridge, which is, I believe, picture number 9, as they approached this bridge, in the distance they could see a bright light of some type behind the top of the trees, and it pretty much shined through some of the tree tops there as they were coming down Coven Abbott Road here. Well, as they neared the bridge here in picture 10, they could tell that this light was coming from over Lake Martin, from over the water, very close to the boat ramp. And the first thought through their, this man said the first thought through his mind was maybe that the power company had come down the week previous and had put in some high-powered light bulbs. But it was just very, very bright. And then he thought to himself, he didn't think that lights on the lake would be that bright. But anyway, as they came to this bridge and they looked to their left, out over the water, they saw where the light was coming from. There was a large saucer-shaped UFO hovering right over the lake, and they said it was probably only like maybe 30 or 40 feet up in the air. And there was a wide white beam of light coming from underneath this UFO, shining down on the surface of the water. And also on the surface of the water was a boat, and they said that there were either 2 or 3 people sitting in the boat, and this beam was shining down on them. He said as they crossed the bridge, he slowed down for a better look to see exactly what was going on out there, because this was a UFO, and he said there was lights all around the edge of this thing, different colored lights. There was a light on the top of the dome part of the UFO, and this very, very bright white light was coming out from under the bottom of it, as I said, shining down onto the lake and onto these poor people in this boat. But he said that their windows was up, and he really didn't take time to roll the windows down or anything, but said the people in this boat looked like they were terrified. They were waving their arms, and they were moving around inside the boat as if yelling for help or something like that. But the man said they went on across the bridge kind of slow, and went on to a little place to where they could turn around to come back, because he wanted to get a better look at what was going on. He said he was probably going about 60 miles an hour when he went across the bridge, but he did slow down some whenever he saw this. But he went on across the bridge and went up the road a little ways to where he could turn around, and that was about a quarter of a mile before he could find a place to turn around. And he said whenever they turned around and they came back across the bridge and looked back out to see what was going on now with the UFO and the people in the boat, he said there was absolutely nothing there. He said the UFO was gone, the light was gone, they did not see the people in the boat at all. He said, as a matter of fact, he and his wife both said that they stopped completely on the bridge and looked out over the water, because there was some light up there in the boat ramp parking lot, and I'm not sure how bright the moon was that night or not, but they said you could see the water out there even though it was dark. And he said that they looked and they never saw anything out there. So it was very possible that the people that was in this boat was abducted that night by this UFO. And if you were one of those people that was in that boat that night and you see this video, I would appreciate you very much contacting me to let me know your story on what happened that night. But anyway, that was a UFO hovering over some people, I guess, fishing on Lake Martin one night. Well, okay, as if you remember earlier in the video when I first started, I said I had a little side story that I was going to tell you about the halfway point between a little town or community called Motley, Alabama, and Alexander City, Alabama. And this afternoon I got on my old work shirt, my old work hat, and I've been getting in a little wood because at night here in Alabama it's still getting cold. It's a beautiful day out there today. It's about 80 degrees, but tonight it could get on down to freezing and everything. But that's sort of what I've been doing while I have taken a break here, thinking about what all I was going to tell you this afternoon. And after I got to thinking about it, about the little story that I wanted to tell you about the halfway point, then there was just so many connections and things that led on to other little side track stories I could tell you. And I guess that's what I need to call this little segment on here is like a sidetrack on a railroad track. Sort of getting sidetracked on stuff. They put a train on the sidetrack to let the main train go by sometimes. And I guess that's what I do is I get on a smaller story to let the big stories go by sometime. But anyway, what I got to thinking about, and I had to make a list where I could even keep up with it. I'm going to tell you to begin with about that little trip that my grandfather, it was a once a year trip to Alexander City. And if you remember earlier, I said that it took me about 3 hours to go down to Alex City this morning and come back. But I'll tell you in a minute how long that it took them. This was back prior to World War II when they carried cotton that they had raised and picked over the year or in the fall, I guess was when you pick cotton. But it had to be carried to market, and it had to be carried down there in a mule-drawn wagon. And it took longer than 3 hours to go to Alexander City, sell your cotton, and come back home. But anyway, we'll get to that in just a minute. But then, of course, the connection to Alexander City is a connection to Hank Williams. I know everybody knows Hank Williams that knows anything about country music. And, of course, Hank Williams lived in that area, Kalijah, for a good while he and his wife Audrey were having some marital problems and everything. Hank actually moved up to Kalijah Beach is what it was called back in those days. There was cabins down there that you could rent. And I'll get back to the cabins in just a minute. I got another connection on the cabin where Hank Williams actually lived for a while. And then whenever you're talking about Kalijah, there was a long one-lane bridge, as I said, that crossed the backwater down there. It was a very dangerous bridge in my opinion. And but now getting back to trips, there's another connection about my grandfather that I want to tell you about a trip that he made to Waco, Texas, also in a wagon. He went there and back. And anyway, then there's another connection to that about, well, let me get back to Hank Williams for just a minute and Alexander City. Everything is connected. I'm just trying to sit here to sort it all out. But anyway, there's a connection again to Hank Williams and Alexander City. Hank was actually arrested in Alexander City one afternoon and had to go to jail. Anyway, I'll tell you about that in just a minute. My father, for many years, said that he once met Hank Williams in a little town in South Alabama called Evergreen. And Evergreen's been in the news lately, if you have heard about that. Talking about Hank, as I said, Hank Williams did write the song Kalijah, and there's several versions on where he wrote it. Some people say he wrote it here, there, and over yonder. Some people say he wrote it in the cabin down there, and but I don't know exactly where he wrote this song, Kalijah. But now years ago, Kalijah was a real wooden Indian, and it stood out in front of, I believe, a restaurant or a cafe down on the little area on Lake Martin that's called, or was called Kalijah Beach. I think it's still called Kalijah down there. And several years ago, there's another connection that I have to Kalijah myself. I have told you many times that I used to sing with a band, this band and that band. I had a band myself. But there was a band in that area called the Drifters. And if you remember, there's a connection there now. If you remember, Hank Williams' band was called the Drifting Cowboys. And I believe that this group, the Drifters, I think they actually took their name kind of in honor of Hank Williams' group. And then let me get back to Hank Williams' band. I did get to meet Hank Williams' band one night in a bar and lounge. I dance hall was what it was. It was on Blue Creek, and I get back to Blue Creek in a minute. There's another connection there. Blue Creek is also located on Lake Martin, and we all used to go down there and dance and everything. And as I said, I actually met Hank Williams' band down there one night. They were playing. I believe somebody else opened for them, and then I believe they were the main. But of course, you could carry your girlfriend or your wife or somebody else's wife or just whoever you wanted to carry down there and dance. I mean, it was just a big dance hall back in those days. A lot of fun down there. I have a lot of good memories of Blue Creek and Big Sam's. Big Sam's was another club on the backwater down there, as was the rodeo club. And I'm putting plugs in for all of these dance halls and everything down there that I used to go to because we all really had a great time back then. But getting back to Kalijah, where it all got started here on this little segment of what I'm talking about. Kalijah was a real wooden Indian. It was a carved Indian one time, and somebody stole the original Kalijah down there. I think he got stole 2 or 3 times, and then somebody would find him. I heard stories one time that they found him kind of like out in the woods where somebody only got a little ways with him, or I'm sure it took several people to pick this big wooden Indian up. But anyway, then it finally got replaced with a concrete Indian down there, and this is a picture of it. But anyway, I want to tell you something about the wooden Indian that I was told one day, just a little ways down below Blue Creek. If you know anything about the Lake Martin area, then you know exactly where I'm talking about. Blue Creek now has boat sales and condos and restaurants. But back in the late 1970s, all it was at Blue Creek was the dance hall, and that was good enough for me. I wish it was back down there now. I would sure like to go. But anyway, just down from Blue Creek is a place called Walnut Hill, and there is a convenience store down there that's called Eagle. I believe it's Eagle Gas Station or Eagle Convenience Store or something like that. But I had an old girlfriend that worked there, and she may still work there now. I hadn't seen her in about 2 or 3 years. Well, ever since my eyes have been giving me trouble. Matter of fact, I had lost her number. But if you go in there, she last I heard that's where she was working. You could mention me, and I'm sure she would remember me. She and I had well, we dated for several years. She's the lady that actually introduced me to the Creek Casino in Wetumpka. She is a big gambler. She wins a lot of money. I'll have to do a video just on her. I guess I could do a video on all of this stuff that I'm talking about, but we'd have to turn it into like a 6 or 8 hour series and put on, just do so much at a time, I guess. But anyway, she is considerably lucky. I have thought several times when we'd go down there, rather than me playing, just let her play my money and maybe do it on halves. She'd keep half, and I would gladly take half. I have known her on several nights to win well in excess of $1,000 down there, and I have to tell you about that sometimes. Some of it's kind of funny. The reason I'm telling you about this Eagle convenience store down there was a man down there told me one afternoon. We got to talking about Indian artifacts and Indian mounds and all this type of stuff. I was down there to pick her up, and we were going to the casino, and I just got to talking to somebody while I was waiting on her to get off that night. But anyway, this particular man told me, he asked me had I ever heard of the original wooden Indian Kalijah, and of course I told him I had heard it, but I had never seen it. That it was stolen long before my time. That I began coming down to Kalijah or Kalijah Beach and that place. Well, there was a dance hall at Kalijah for many years that I was scheduled to sing with this band, the Drifters I was telling you about. I was going to sing down there one night. And another connection there, I guess. I was going, my opening song was going to be a Hank Williams song, Honky Tonk Blues. But anyway, we didn't get to sing it that night, and I'll have to tell you about that in a little bit as a connection, because that was kind of a funny story, and I did something that night that I had never done before, and I've never done ever since. Let me see what else I have got to tell you about. As for the connection with the casino, it is owned by the Porch Creek Indians, who are Creek Indians, and that's what Kalijah was supposed to be also, was a Creek Indian down there. But anyway, there is just more connections to this one little video about a trip to Alexander City than what I can keep up with. But anyway, I'll try to get started the best I can. Okay, now before we get any further, let me back up just a little bit. I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here. I got a little something I want to tell you about that man that I met down at the Eagle convenience store or gas station, or whatever it's called, that afternoon. He and I were out on the front porch, and we just got to talking. He introduced himself, and of course I did. I don't remember his name or where he said he was from or what he did or anything like that. Well, we were talking about Indian artifacts, and he had brought up Kalijah, the old wooden Indian. And he asked me, had I ever heard any stories on that? And I told him no, only that I had heard that it had been stolen. The original one had years ago and never been found. And he said from where we were standing, said he knew for a fact, because he had seen the Indian, wooden Indian Kalijah was in somebody's house in that area within 5 miles of that store. Now, whether he knew what he was talking about, whether he was telling the truth, is a completely different story. I don't know. I didn't know the man. I only met him that one time and never saw him again. But that was what he told me, that the original Kalijah Indian had been in this house almost ever since it had been stolen from the cafe or restaurant or wherever it was where the original Indian that Hank Williams wrote the song about. Okay, now this second UFO sighting comes from a doctor. This particular doctor lived on Lake Martin, he and his wife. Matter of fact, both of them were doctors. And I'm not sure if they have retired or if they're still practicing or whatever. They both practiced in Opelika. There's the hospital down there, I believe it's called East Alabama Medical Center. And their office was pretty close to the hospital at the time. I'm telling you that because that'll play into the story in just a minute. But anyway, this doctor knew me through a patient or a mutual friend that we both had. And this friend had told this doctor that I was very interested in paranormal activity and that type of stuff. And anyway, through that, we got together. I did go to his office one day to talk to him. That way it would just be normal, like an office visit. I guess nobody would think anything about it. But anyway, that was where he told me his encounter. And he made it very plain that I should not use, could not use his name, or had better not use his name. And I'll also tell you that in just a second or two. Anyway, I went to this particular doctor's office. He was in the area of East Alabama Medical Center, which is a very large hospital in Opelika down there, and you could see the hospital from the window in the examination room where we were at when he told me this particular encounter. Anyway, I introduced myself to him, and we talked there for a few moments, and he told me, he said, I have a UFO encounter or sighting that I would like to tell you, but I said I do not want my name used at all, and said it could very well cost me my practice. It could very well cost me my job. And I told him I very well understood that. He didn't have anything to worry about when he told me that I kept everything completely confidential. But anyway, he walked over to the window, and he opened the blinds that were on the window, and through the window you could see East Alabama Medical Center. And he said, asked me had I ever been in that particular hospital, and I told him no, that I had never been in that hospital. And he said the 6th floor is the psychiatric ward, and he said it is a place that you don't really want to have to spend the night, or you don't really want to be in the psychiatric ward over there. I said there's some very sick people over there. But anyway, he said if my name ever got out, he said all it would take from me is just one signature on one piece of paper, and said they would come get you and commit you there for as long as I said. So anyway, whenever I took his report down in my files, I don't even have his real name in case somebody might come across those files someday. There's no way that he could ever be found out. So I knew what he was talking about. It could cost him a lot if this ever got out on this particular doctor. As I said, he and his wife had a home on Lake Martin. So let's get back to Lake Martin for a minute. He told me that on many, many occasions that they had sat on their back deck and had actually seen and witnessed UFOs fly into the lake and UFOs fly out of the lake. He said sometimes the UFOs would come down from the sky, sometimes they would hover for just a few seconds, then they would enter the water easily. He said they had also later at night, say after midnight or so, he said, was usually when this happened. He said sometimes UFOs would come out of the sky, probably not at full speed, but said they would hit the water with a great impact and make a large splash, and said it was a pretty good ways out into the lake. It wasn't near the shore where their house was, but he said you could still hear the splash whenever the craft actually hit the surface of the water. He said on other occasions there had been times that they had been sitting on their back deck, and he was sure other people around the lake had seen the same thing, that they would be sitting out there sometimes at night, and these UFOs would come to just the surface, just beneath the surface of the water, and would move around for a little bit. And he said then all of a sudden they might lift up out of the water. And he said several of them would hover there for a few minutes, and said you could actually hear and see the water running off the UFO whenever it came up out of the water. And he said, of course, as those approaching and entering the water sometimes fast, he said sometimes there were UFOs that came out of the water fast and left a trail of water. And he said you could actually see the water. If the moonlight was shining real good that night, you could actually see a little stream of water coming off the UFO and falling back into the lake. So anyway, to add to that, here a few years ago, I had in one of my previous videos that a man that I took for a deathbed confession, because he only lived a short time after he told me this. He was already in a very bad health, and I guess he just had some things he wanted to tell and talk about and that type of stuff. And I did go down there to see him one day, and he told me that for many years that he worked in an underground government facility under Lake Martin. He said it was actually built when the lake was built, and then when the water backed up, it could not be seen. And he said that there were UFOs back in those days that actually entered the water and left Lake Martin, as this doctor was telling. He didn't go into a lot of detail about what he did there or what this facility was, only that he was a scientist that worked under Lake Martin. Now, whether that's true or not, I have absolutely no way at all of proving that there is a facility under the lake. I have heard from other people over the years that it was believed that there was a government facility under Lake Martin. And by what this doctor and his wife have seen, it kind of leads credence to that there possibly, very possibly is something under Lake Martin. But anyway, that was 2 UFO stories from Lake Martin that I thought you might enjoy, and I hope you did. But what I want to tell you about this trip that my grandparents, and I'm not sure how many of my aunt and uncles, or if my mother had been born yet, and they all made the trip. I do remember my mother telling about going to Alexander City, and in this particular fashion as riding a wagon. And as I said, this would have been pre-World War II. Anyway, as I said earlier, it took me about 3 hours to go down there and back. My grandfather said that it took about 4 days. And this was a trip of about 30-something miles, maybe about 35 to 40 miles. Anyway, what they did, they left a little community of Motley, and they came almost to New Site, Alabama. Now, in those days, of course, Highway 22 wasn't there. It was all dirt roads and trails and this type of stuff. And I'm not sure how many bales of cotton they carried on the wagon. And as I have said in earlier videos, I believe a bale of cotton had to weigh 500 pounds at that time, and it had to be in a bale form before they would buy it at the cotton gin or wherever it was that they had to carry it in those days. But anyway, he said this particular place, where I'm not going to give the exact location, although I do know the lady that owns the land and the property there, and I had never met this lady until about 3 or 4 years ago. And every time that we used to go to Alexander City, as I said, my grandfather would say this is the halfway point between where we used to live over around Motley, which is in Clay County, and Alexander City. Said we had to go down there to sell cotton, do whatever else they had to do. And it was only a once-a-year trip, this little 35 or 40 mile trip. As I said, they only made it once a year back in those days. But let me get back to this lady that I was telling you about. I always had in my mind if I ever saw anybody at this particular house that I was going to stop and ask them had they ever heard this little story that my grandfather always told me every time that I carried him down to Ellick City. And I was going down the road one day, and I saw this beautiful woman out in the yard. She was digging out under a tree. I'm not sure what she was digging, but she had a shovel, and she was doing some work out there in the yard. And she was a very pretty woman. And so I said, well, I'd better stop and talk to her right quick. So anyway, at least I had a excuse for stopping and talking to her. So anyway, I got out and told her who it was. Of course, she saw the Alabama Bigfoot Society sign on my Jeep back in those days when I still had my Jeep. I got to talking to her, and I told her why I wanted to talk to her, what I wanted to ask her about. That my grandfather, as I said, always said this was where the halfway point was. And he also said that they camped out there one night as they were going to Alexander City. And that's what I told this lady. I said, he said that this was where they camped out as they were going, and they camped out here as they came back. And had she ever heard that story? And she said she had heard very similar stories from her grandparents. Also, they actually ran a little a store at this particular location. Now, this picture of these three trees are similar to the three oak trees that was in the yard up there that they set camp up under whenever they were going to Alexander City. Anyway, she told me that she had heard that people camped out and they cooked there and they ate there sometimes. And she even showed me the old well where he, in his story, had said that they had always got water out of this particular well. And this lady was nice enough to show it to me. I wish I could tell you who she was, but if I do, I know everybody in Tallapoosa County will know exactly who I'm talking about. And even more stories like this, I prefer to keep people's identities as secret as I can. But anyway, she just backed up exactly what he had told me. They would leave, they would get to this point, they would set up camp. He said a lot of times there would be like 6 or 8 families there at night. Said they would all get together a lot of times and cook, eat. Everybody ate together. He said sometimes some of them had banjos or fiddles or guitars, and they would make music there, and some of them would dance and have a big time on the way down. Then they had to get up the next morning. They had to go on to Alexander City, where they sold the cotton and bought whatever they needed, I guess, for the coming year, like shoes or clothing or whatever they had to buy. Then they came back here the next day. They would leave Alexander City and they would come back to this point again. So that was made 3 days. And then from this particular point here on to where my grandfather and them lived took about another day. But now you've got to take into consideration that they were traveling by a mule-drawn wagon in those days. And depending on how much cotton was in that wagon, the old mule couldn't pull it as fast as he could probably coming back home. But what was so fascinating and interesting to me was for about a 35 or 40 mile trip that, like I said, that I make now like in 3 hours. It took them like 4 days to make it, and that hasn't been that long ago. It was like back in the 1920s and the 1930s was whenever this happened. So technology and roads and that type of stuff have come a long way since the early 1900s. Okay, now one other little connection to this story I'll go on and tell you right quick. This is a picture of the old Kalijah Bridge. Now, it's supposed to be a picture of the old Kalijah Bridge. I'm not sure if it is or not, but the bridge looked very similar to this. It was a one-lane bridge back in those days, and we're talking about connections to this story. I'll have another connection. I'll just try to tell this real quick before I do get any further. I want to tell you about another trip that my grandfather made to Waco, Texas. And I'm just going to say from where I live now is in Wadley, Alabama. And he said that he went from here to Waco, Texas and back in a wagon. This would have also been pre-World War II. But I got on the computer a while ago and checked mileage from Wadley, Alabama to Waco, Texas. And now if you travel by Interstate I-20, it's 780 miles. So I'm pretty sure back in those days, the roads wasn't as modern as they are now. And of course, it was a lot slower. But anyway, I figure it was about 1,000 miles, probably the way that he went out there and back, because you just had to get out there the best way you could, I guess, in a horse-drawn or a mule-drawn wagon. But what had happened, he and my grandmother had got married. Her family didn't particularly like him, and they were originally from Waco, Texas, and that's where some of my Native American ancestry comes in. I'm not sure of what tribe of Indians that it was out there, that either my great great grandmother or great great grandfather on that side was one of those Indians. I did look it up a while ago, and it said Wichita Indians lived in that area back in those days. I just figured from the tempers that we all had, it was Apache or Comanche one. And my grandmother did have some brothers that looked a lot like Apache Indians, and it very well could have been. I don't know. They were just had the Indian nose, the face, everything. They just really favored or resembled Apache Indians that were out in Texas and that area in the early West. But anyway, what had happened, her family had moved back to Waco after they got married. As I said, they didn't want him in the family. They didn't like him for some reason. And but anyway, he said after a period of time that he decided that he would go out there after. I think they had written some letters back and forth, and they still wanted to be with each other. So he just takes off in the wagon one day and goes out there. But he said while he was out there that he had to get a job. And I'm not sure where he worked or who he worked for out there, but he said they worked like out in fields out there. I'm sure it was cattle or raising crops or something out there. But he was telling about they had to dig big pits out there, because when these twisters or cyclones came up, that you had to run and go dive in one of these pits or you were liable to get blown away. It was just real interesting the way that he could tell it. He could tell it better than I could, because he was actually out there doing it. But he said these twisters would go right by you, or right up. Of course, I know a twister's large and everything, but that's what he was telling in those particular days, that they actually dug pits for protection out there. And when one of these things started coming across the plain or whatever out there, that you had better get in one of these pits, or you would be blown away. But anyway, I wonder how long I was young whenever he told this story. I just wonder how long it took him to go out there and back. I do remember asking him one time how far could they travel a day in a wagon like that. And he said it averaged about 15 miles. If you were doing between 15 and 20 miles a day, you were really pushing the horse or mule to travel that distance that day. But you have to take into consideration too that there wasn't very many roads. Most of it was just little rough trails through the woods and that type of stuff. So it was would have been an experience, I am sure. But anyway, that was another little connection to what I was telling you tonight. Okay, and I guess that's going to about do it tonight. We're going to wind this video on up, and I hope you enjoyed those two UFO stories. I also hope you enjoyed all those little sidetrack connection stories there to Lake Martin. Lake Martin has been a very big part of my life over the years, as you can probably tell. Anyway, as I always do, I want to say hello to my granddaughter Madison. I would like to tell you also that the Alabama Bigfoot Society is run completely out of pocket, and if you would like to make a donation, or if you're in a position to where you can and would like to, that would be very much appreciated. All you have to do is to go to our website, alabamabigfootsociety.com, and there on the front page you'll find a place where you can make that donation. If you like this video, I want you to give us a like, and if you enjoy it or you like what we're doing down here with our paranormal work, then I hope you would subscribe to the channel so you can keep up with what we're doing. But before I do go, I would like to say one more time that I would like to do this video in memory of the original drummer for the Drifters band, Eddie Langley, who was a very good friend of mine. With all that being said, I guess I'll be looking for you next time on the next Alabama adventure, getting close to Bigfoot.